Yeah, I think I would say what many of the reformers said in the 16th century. With the Latin phrase "ad fontes," go to the source. Go to the source. We do have the scriptures available to us now. Go to the source, read the scriptures, which is why I just, the side note, I want to just say to every particularly Western Christian who reads English, do you know what an incredible blessing you have? And just the economic availability of having the scriptures. The vast majority of Christians who have ever lived simply did not have those resources.
Welcome back to Matters in Meaning. In this episode, we explore the matter of historical responsibility and look at it specifically through the lens of the Christian worldview. Today's guest is Jym Gregory, a pastor at a local church in Indiana. Jym's past experiences include law enforcement, working in higher education, and serving as a missionary internationally. Jym holds bachelor's and master's degrees in psychology from Eastern Illinois University, and a master's of divinity and a doctorate in ministry from the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. Enjoy this conversation with Jym. Throughout the centuries, some sought to witness by the word spoken and written, others by prayer and renunciation, and still others by the force of arms and the threat of inquisitional fires. Like it or not, we are heirs to this host of diverse and even contradictory witnesses. Some of their actions we may find revolting, and others inspiring. But all of them form a part of our history. All of them, those whose actions we admire, as well as those whose actions we despise, brought us to where we are now. In this new century, as in every age, Christians face new and unexpected challenges. In seeking to be obedient in our response to such challenges, we have the resources of past times when other believers found themselves in similar situations. The response of the early church to a culture that often saw it with indifference or even contempt may provide guidance at a time when similar attitudes prevail in much of Western society. The manner in which the church in the 4th and 5th centuries responded to migration of entire nations may provide insight into possible ways to interpret and to respond to the demographic upheavals of our time. The devotion of medieval scholastic and of Protestant reformers may be an inspiration to budding scholars and theologians. The history of missions in the 19th century may well warn us of the pitfalls the church faces when it crosses cultural and social boundaries. In all of this, the past will illumine the present. But the opposite is always true. As we look at those and other past times and events, we do so through the lens of our time, our own concerns, our own hopes. History is not the pure past. History is a past interpreted from the present of the historian. Thus, our understanding of the early martyrs and heretics, of monastics, pastors, crusaders, and scholars, as well as our understanding of everyday Christian life in the past, will be both marked and enriched by our present-day lenses. It is into this dialogue that we now enter. But kind of like I said just a second ago, the idea of thinking about something a lot individually for you as a person and thinking it's important, then you bring it up to somebody else, and all of a sudden you realize it's not important. The passage that I read from that book, The Story of Christianity, I'm going to read that in the introduction. So at this point, any listeners will have kind of a context of what it means when I say historical responsibility or being heirs of the past. And so what I wanted to just kind of do is just kind of open it up to you with just kind of that broad question of, have you ever considered, and specifically, I want to consider the idea of historical responsibility and answering it from a Christian worldview perspective.
Yeah.
And so is that an idea or a topic that you've ever considered before? Like, what are we inheriting as heirs of the past, as specifically as Christians?
Yeah, it is. It is. I think it's an important topic. It's a timely topic in the sense that I think that it's been asked at different stages, right, in Christian history, and certainly I think it's become more important. I don't know. So many things have become more important in the last 15 years in at least in Western history, and so yeah, I think it's a question. I don't know that I've ever gone in depth into my own analysis of that, but it's certainly a question that has crossed my mind, and I've had casual conversations with people about the importance of how all of this historically works together, how that makes us who we are today, what's our worldview supposed to be like, both individually, corporately. I think they're all very legitimate and worthwhile, topics.
Okay. And so I kind of, when you think about it from a Christian worldview perspective, when we think about inheriting things from the past, right? You can apply that in a lot of different ways. You could have a familial person, who did something and you have inherited that as a result of one or two generations later. You can think about it from obviously a worldview or religious perspective of people who were or claimed to be of a certain faith who did things, and then now we inherit, but not so much responsibility, but consequences, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, yeah.
So is there is there a biblical category or a biblical reference to something like that?
To the inheriting of that historical, whether it's a weight or I guess it can go both positive and negative. I mean, I think there's historical precedence to that. Oh, I think one of the questions, that were laid out was, are there like specific biblical examples of that? I think in general there are. I don't know that we have specific examples of a person trying to take responsibility for other people's sin and repenting for that sin. Obviously, if you look at the big picture and what Christ is doing as he receives our sin, that certainly, I think, qualifies. I think there are some examples in Scripture where we get the sense of the weightiness of the history of the people. Obviously, I think we see that most clearly in the people of Israel and the leaders of Israel understanding and receiving some of the responsibility of decisions that previous leaders and generations had made. I don't know if there's a one-to-one correlation to what we've seen in some examples here in the last 20 years or so of one leader receiving the responsibility for past generations and then leading out for a current people group or group of believers, whatever the case might be, now repenting on their behalf. I don't know that we have any one-to-one correlations. I would say there are some apples to oranges comparisons and maybe not as many apples to apples comparisons as we would maybe some people would want to allude to. Although, unless there's something there that you would say, hey, I've thought about this and here's an example, and I would be happy to think about that and talk through some of that.
Well, I think one of the things that I think is interesting is the delineation between consequence and responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
Because do you agree with that kind of assessment of the idea of, hey, there's people who have done things in the past. So for me as a Christian, I know that there's people who have either claimed to be Christians or who have been Christians who have made decisions, and therefore those consequences have follow-on impacts that could still affect us today. And we'll get into that hopefully a little bit later.
Yeah.
And then there's I see a difference between that and being held responsible for something that you yourself did not. And so, have you ever thought about the delineation between those two things? And the reason I bring that up is it seems like a simple thing, but I feel like those waters are kind of getting a little muddied in our culture today. Would
Yeah.
you agree with that assessment, or kind of consider that idea worth thinking about?
Yeah, I do think the waters are getting muddy there. Absolutely. I think there's a difference between, for lack of a better term, owning what past generations may have done in the name. Again, we're talking here in general terms, like of in the name of Christ, but and then saying, and I bear a responsibility for that. I do think there's a difference there. Certainly we could just look. We wouldn't have to look all the way back to the biblical examples. We can look to the history of our own country and chattel slavery. All of the apologizing that's being done for that. And again, it's not that I think there's anything inherently wrong or sinful about that. I think it's good that we see the past and own up to it, so to speak. But then to ask a current generation to take responsibility for what a past generation did, whether it was in the name of a religion or in the name of a political system or because of a ethnicity or racial background, that I think starts getting, with the word you use, I think it gets pretty muddy. And now all of a sudden it's like, okay, understanding it, feeling a sense of sorrow for past historical events, and then saying, and I will bear responsibility for that. And I think somehow I can apologize for that. At least in my opinion, gets beyond biblical parameters of repentance, and I think just logical parameters of repentance, and or seeking to right, a past wrong.
Okay. And so as I've kind of thought about this, there's kind of two veins. There's kind of the historical element of it, and then there's kind of like some of the practical applications of the modern day. So what I want to do is kind of talk a little bit about some of the modern day things, and
Yeah,
then maybe circle back to the historicity, because your experience in the Catholic Church, a lot of these things happened underneath the banner of the Catholic Church. And so like
yeah,
what does that
point
relationship
taken. Yes.
look like? Yeah. And so but I've seen I've seen polar opposite responses to this idea of responsibility versus consequence, specifically from a Christian or quote unquote Christian response to this. One has been an example that I sent you of maybe Pope Francis and Indigenous peoples in Canada, and
Yeah,
he talks about completely taking ownership and responsibility, and then also saying that there's nothing that could be done to ever make it right. So you have this completely
yeah,
unreconcilable element of approach, which I don't think is right or healthy. And then you
right,
also have this gentleman named Raymond Ibrahim who's talking about people not being Christians because of certain materialistic approaches or metaphysical versus physical approaches, and
right.
virtually in essence using it as a just war theory to kind of lay the framework to say, hey, you can't vilify these people in the past because of how violent they were. And so virtually you have somebody who doesn't acknowledge anything, and then somebody who completely takes ownership of something without any sense of redemption. And I feel like that those two things are extreme.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to ask you is specifically, do you see a balance between those two? Or do you feel like both have merit in their own right, but a balance, like how does the Christian strike the balance between those two?
Yeah, as it's a great question. I do think there's a balance there, like there is in almost any topic we address, biblical or extra biblical. There seems to be a balance there oftentimes. Um, you've got some people like, as notable as J.I. Packer, who would say balance is a terrible word we shouldn't use in relation to biblical concepts. And I love Packer, but I disagree with his view. Balance, I think, is a beautiful thing. And, specifically related to what you just now talked about, I think there is a balance there. I think it's also possible when you're saying, look, let's find the balance to say, here's where someone like Ibrahim, he makes some good, solid points. And here's where maybe Pope Francis was trying to do a good thing and maybe went too far. And I wouldn't land in either one of those camps. However, are there redeemable aspects of both sides of that? I think there are in most cases. There are some, obviously, they're just so beyond the pale that it's hard to find any redeemable aspects to them. But I do think there's a balance there, and I think as Christ followers, we're called to find that balance and not always land on one extreme or another. We're just a polarizing people, generally speaking. We tend to jump into one pole or the other, and I think that's almost always detrimental. So.
Yeah. And kind of to take that one step further, how would you encourage a Christian to approach a conversation with somebody who is maybe approaching the conversation with this unredeemable looking back to the past historically of, hey, Christians have done this? Say somebody brings up the conquistadors in Central and South America who were, under the banner of the Catholic Church, had priests with them. And, the reality is that, horrible things happened. Would you say, hey, listen, this is what it looks like when people claim, quote unquote, to be Christians and then they're doing things that are completely unbiblical? Like, how would you approach a conversation with somebody like that in terms of prioritizing how you approach responding?
Yeah, well, I think I want to use some biblical categories. Peter tells us that we should always be prepared to give a defense. There, he's talking particularly about our faith in light of persecution. He says to do it with gentleness and respect. I think there he means gentleness towards the person. I personally think of that passage in 1 Peter 3. He's talking about respect there. He uses the Greek word phobos, which means to fear. I think he's talking about a fear of God and understanding we are always in earshot, as it were, of God, and therefore we should be careful about the language that we use. We have multiple examples of Paul telling Timothy, in particular, "Hey, and be respectful. Don't get into silly arguments. Don't quarrel. Don't squabble over matters." So I think the key in any of those conversations is to try to be as respectful, gentle as we can possibly be, not to try to jump into it so quickly onto one side or the other. the typical types of communication, politeness, letting people tell their story before we jump into it and start interrupting them constantly. At the same time, I would be encouraging a person to say, let's look at the facts. Let's not look at just what we may think we know. We've got to look at the facts. I mean, the example you just now gave, there's a significant difference between the work of the conquistadors in the South and the Crusades. There's just, although there are some parallels, there's a significant difference of what was taking place in both of those scenarios. And I just think you have to be reasonable, logical, kind. But I think we also have to push back at times and just say, I don't think you're approaching this with a historical accuracy, or even sometimes with an understanding that there can be another side of this story, that probably needs to be heard.
Yeah. When you think about those historical events, specifically thinking about them, and I know you just kind of referenced we need to go back and look at the facts. How would you approach communication with somebody in culture who's seeing maybe those wave top headlines, and then they use that as a mechanism for attacking the Christian message? How would you go about communicating to them, acknowledging the reality of those things, but then also at the same time getting past that and getting to like actually what actually matters, which I believe it would be the gospel?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so, like, how does a Christian approach that conversation? That's one of the things I thought a lot about that I'm really interested to hear your feedback on.
yeah. Yeah, I think much of it obviously depends on the setting. If I'm sitting down with someone across the table, um, and they seem to be interested in the gospel, and yet they ask a question, that pertains to something like that. It's very likely I'm not going to do a lot of pushing back on that. Maybe even for the moment, I might just say you've got some very legitimate concerns there, and those are many of those are based on facts that we just need to own. Um, but I probably am going to push back very significantly on that, because my goal there obviously is to share the gospel, and this would be um, uh, way tertiary to the gospel. We can readdress issues like this at a later time. If it seems to be the issue that's keeping them from hearing the gospel, then I'm likely going to try to push back gently and say. There are other things to consider. However, we certainly, as Christ followers, need to recognize our forefathers, so to speak, uh, behaved and acted, and should we be honoring those type of actions simply because they're Christians? And I think we have to answer no to that. We have not just the right, but I think the responsibility to say that was not right, that was not correct, that is not how Christ would have called us to behave in that situation. And I think we just have to own that. Now, if it's a situation I'm with somebody, they know I'm a Christ follower, and this is the main thing we're talking about, right? They want to maybe they're an atheist who wants to prove that Christianity is false because of those past behaviors. Then I think I'm going to push back a little bit harder and say, hey, let's consider again the factual evidence here. And if we're going to dismiss Christianity out of hand because of past behaviors, then we have to dismiss virtually every single religion, including the peaceful ones like Baha'i and others. We just have to dismiss them all, because we've all got a history of not just negative things, but sometimes incredibly violent and unacceptable things in the past. And I don't think those can be used as immediate disqualifiers for the veracity of the Christian faith, any more than I would want to use those as immediate disqualifier for the veracities of Islam, or um, Hinduism, or any of the other major religions of the world. I think they're questions we have to answer, but I don't think any of those become immediate disqualifiers. There's much more we need to talk about, rather than just saying we disqualify that because of the people of the past who claimed that name.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's almost like that kind of idea of disqualification. It almost like it bears a resemblance to the kind of cancel culture that was
Mhm.
created in our world. That was just like anything that crossed the line must be absolutely and completely dismissed out of hand. you kind of hinted at it there of I think that one of the things that anybody would look at it, and I'm kind of thinking about it for myself as just an average Christian who's just trying to live the life that the Lord has assigned to me. Right. And that is to, when I respond to something like that, say somebody brings up the Crusades and I'm like, hey, listen, like if you look at, if you look at, I believe it was Clement, was it Clement the Second, or who was it that pronounced the Crusade, the first Crusade?
Urban the second.
Urban II. And so Urban II, as he announced that crusade, they're talking about things that are clearly unbiblical. They're talking about, being saved as a result of service. They're talking about, obviously, you can go back to the Catholic Church and indulgences and stuff like that. And so I guess this would be a great opportunity to transition into, for you, would it be fair to say you were raised in the Catholic Church, or would you say you spent time in the Catholic Church when you were younger?
No, I'm a cradle Catholic. I was raised in the Catholic Church and stayed there until I was 18 years old. So, and you know, I would call myself a quintessential Catholic, right? My entire family, my parents had 14 children in obedience to the Catholic faith. Yeah, I mean, I was born and raised and steeped in Roman Catholicism.
Yeah, and so the reason I think that that's really fascinating and interesting, now one of the reasons that I think you're so well positioned to have this conversation is so many of those historical errors of the past, historical responsibility events would have taken place underneath or influenced by the Catholic Church. And the world doesn't delineate between at least most people that I've met who aren't believers. There's not really a delineation between people who are genuinely followers of Christ and people who just kind of claim the Christian blanket banner. Um,
Yes.
and so there's no delineation between the two. So I think that it's easy for a Christian to just say, well, that's not Christianity, but the
Mhm.
world doesn't see any difference. With so many of those taking place on the side of the Catholic Church, how does maybe the Protestant navigate that tension between, because would you consider, I don't know if that question's fair, Pastor Jim, to ask to you, like, is Catholicism and biblical Christianity, are they the same thing? Can they be, and I know that that's like that's a very big question, I know, but
Yeah, I think my basic answer to that would be I'd want to delineate between Catholic and Roman Catholic, right? If we're talking Catholic small c, then we're talking about the Church of Christ, the universal church. If we're talking about Roman Catholic, yes, I think much of what, I mean, if you're going to go back to the Crusades and, obviously you don't have what we would call Protestantism until the 16th century. So everything before that, I think people lump under Roman Catholicism. And I would say the Roman Catholic Church was certainly, um, uh, uh, influential, big, all those things. But there was an Orthodox Church. There were examples of folks who were not in communion with either the Roman Catholic, the Western Church, or the Eastern Church. So we have to be careful about over lumping everything here. I think people, they just want to say Christianity is Christianity, just like Islam is Islam, and just like every form of Buddhism is the same form of Buddhism. And that just, quite frankly, without sounding pejorative here, that just demonstrates ignorance, that there are significant differences in all of these major religions, including Christianity. Now, to the question of um, is um, is the Roman Catholic faith representative of Christianity? I would say it depends on the situation. Up until the 6th century, 5th century, I would say by and large, yes. You're talking about the majority of the early church fathers that both Protestants and Catholics would look back to, and say that we have we're living out our faith on their shoulders. As the Catholic Church becomes more of a Western church out of Rome, when you start seeing some of the Catholic dogmas begin to emerge that I think, and personally, are contrary to the revealed word, to the scriptures, then I would say, no, I wouldn't look to Roman Catholicism at that time and say that by and large represents Christianity. There were certainly some within the Catholic communion, the Roman Catholic communion, who I look back to and have much respect for. But I wouldn't want to lump everything under what the Roman Catholic Church was doing the Western Church was doing out of out of Rome, or quite frankly, what the Eastern Church was doing, out of Constantinople. They don't represent everybody, and they certainly don't represent the vast majority of people who would call themselves Protestant today.
Okay. I also think then about the reality of certain events that took place under the Protestant Church as well. If you think about, even the 30 Years' War, like that's a great example of a historical event that I would love to pick your brain about. Is you have somebody who's not a believer, they look back into the past and they're like, man, I see Catholics and I see Protestants just slaughtering each other by the droves, committing atrocities during the 30 Years' War. You
Yeah.
know, how do we as Christians, when you think about historical responsibility, we're inheriting that event. How do we, or how would you go about explaining that to somebody who has the question of like, hey man, like, when I look back and I see these realities of Christianity, I just don't see the merit. You know what I mean? Like, how would you approach that conversation, or how would you approach, that question?
Yeah, those are a little bit even stickier, I think, than talking about the historical violence between, say, Christianity in general and Islam in general, because here you have two groups that would claim Christ, and likely in both groups you would have genuine Christ followers, and yet you have this history of violence, and not just violence, but graphic, brutal. Um, there's a way to kill a person, and there's a way to kill a person. And some of this was just horrific, on both sides, right? It's not like the Catholics did it worse than the Protestants did. Someone who I appreciate so much, even as someone like Calvin, who I don't agree with everything that Calvin. There's nobody I agree with everything on, but Calvin sat over the trial that ended up burning, having a man burned at the stake, Michael Servetus, for what they found, which again, Servetus was wrong in his views of Trinitarian Christianity, but to have him burned at the stake. Now, in Calvin's defense, he didn't want to burn him; he wanted to have him beheaded as an act of mercy. But nevertheless, he was for killing Servetus for a viewpoint that he held. I think we all would look back on that. The vast majority, not all, obviously, but the vast majority of us would look back on that and say, there's no justification for that. It's a result of sin on both sides, and we shouldn't try to justify that. We should say, yeah, that shouldn't have been done. That shouldn't have been done. I don't know what else you can say about that, though. I wasn't there. I couldn't try to convince Calvin. I couldn't convince the Catholics and the Protestants during the 30-Year War or the Troubles in Northern Ireland. All of those things, I think we should look back on and say, shame on them, on us, only if we would look at those and say, there's justification for all of that. Now, once again, without trying to nitpick everything, were there some events in all of those that you would say that was so unjustified on one side or the other that there likely needed to be some sort of response, either militarily or legally, to stop that kind of action? Then I would say, yeah, but you've got to start looking at individual situations in its totality. I don't know how any Christian now would be able to say, yeah, those things were justified. Those were good things. They just weren't. They're a result of sinful human beings doing what Christ specifically called us not to do. There's really no gray area there. He specifically told us not to do those things.
Yeah, and I guess one of the things that brings to mind for me, Pastor Jym, is this. It's hard for me to fathom and understand historically how people could err so vastly based off of what we had in the Bible. And as I read the New Testament, it's hard to see how somebody who would be or claim to be a Christian could pursue such ends as we've seen historically in the past.
Yeah.
And so I guess think back to maybe the 30 Years' War, or maybe even back to the Crusades. Did they have the Bible as we have it now then?
During the 30 Years' War, Yes, they had it. Did they have it like we have it now, John? That's a great question. I think the answer is no. Okay. Did every Christian have a Bible like we would here in the West? No, clearly not, particularly as it relates to the Crusades. The scriptures were intentionally not translated by the Roman Catholic Church into the vernacular of the common people because you don't want people messing things up. You need trained priests to interpret the scriptures for people. So I think a lot of people, particularly Protestants today, they think, why would the Catholic Church not want the Bible translated? It's because the Bible's dangerous, they saw it. And you don't want your common person, you don't want some peasant reading the Bible and getting crazy ideas. Therefore, you've got to have somebody who can interpret it for them. So no, absolutely. The vast majority of Christians at that time would not have had access to just go read the scriptures and say, this is what it would have been interpreted for them in the Mass or in some sense of teaching that would have come through essentially the priesthood. That changes obviously just prior to the Protestant Reformation and then during the Protestant Reformation. In terms of the 30 Years' War, there are some similarities there. You're not, just because of the cost of printing, you just don't have people who have access to the scriptures like we have access to the scriptures today, which is why I just, the side note, I want to just say to every particularly Western Christian who reads English, do you know what an incredible blessing you have? And just the economic availability of having the scriptures. The vast majority of Christians who have ever lived simply did not have those resources. So for us to say, why didn't they just go read the Bible and see what Jesus said for himself? It's because they either couldn't, they were illiterate, or they were just not available to them. Now, certainly, I think if we're talking about the Protestants and Catholics in the 30-Year War as it related to, in juxtaposing that with the Crusaders, they would have had more access than the Crusaders, but certainly not even close to the access that we have to now. That's a long way of saying, John, I don't think it's quite right for us to say, how could they have been so ignorant to not have seen, to not have known the scriptures well enough to have pushed back on this. Part of it is they didn't have access. Part of it was being interpreted for them. And most of us we're going to accept what has been told to us by the experts. That's true even today. We have to be careful about that, but it's true even today. And then we just have to understand a different milieu of life. I mean, the worldview was so significantly different than it is today. We just see that in the difference between 80 years ago in World War II and today, right? In World War II, you wanted to take Dresden, you firebombed it. And, tens of thousands of people killed by the Americans in the bombing of Dresden. That was not pushed back on as a war crime. But today, we're in a war right now with Iran. We could end that war very quickly by just raising Tehran. You just don't do that. The worldview doesn't allow that, nor would I advocate for that. But the worldview would not allow that today. Wars are fought differently now than they were just one generation ago.
Yeah, that's an amazing common sense point that as you kind of lay that out, there's a lot of common sense there that I didn't even realize, because just the historical point of knowing that how few people had access to the scriptures, because my immediate thought is exactly as you said, Jim, was that why didn't they just read the Bible? That's immediately what I think.
Yeah.
And then now that you lay that out, I see my own ignorance as you've pointed that out. And so I think one thing that people might come to is just is they might try to push back on arguments like that of like, okay, well, what does that then say about the heart of the message, that the fruit of that message is turning into violence? Do you think that, or how would the Christian respond to that in terms of, hey, it's more of an indicator of the nature of man rather than the nature of the message? Because another way of saying that is like, hey, Islam. It's like, well, you can't tell me that Christianity is any different than Islam, because look at all the things from the past historically that have taken place where people have perverted the Bible. And it's
Right.
like, well, people are doing the same thing to the Quran as well. So it's like, hey, what makes Christianity right? So it's like, how do I, as a Christian, how do we respond to that challenge? Or how would you encourage somebody to enter into that conversation?
Yeah, I think I would say what many of the reformers said in the 16th century. With the Latin phrase "ad fontes," go to the source. Go to the source. We do have the scriptures available to us now. Go to the source. Read the scriptures. Listen, that's why I'm a Protestant today and not a Roman Catholic. And that's not to say I don't have a lot of respect for much of what the Roman Catholic Church has done and stood for and still does to this day. And I'm thankful for what my parents gave me, but I went to the source. So if we keep going, making our decisions on fundamentally important issues in life based on just what we're told, we're going to come up with some really skewed understandings, I think, of these things. So again, I would say, do you want to know what Jesus had to say about things? Go to the Gospels and hear the words of Jesus. Um, again, I'm not a pacifist. I do think that there is. I think just war theory is just. Not everybody's just war theory is just, but I think there is a just war theory if we can land on it that is biblical. Um, C.S. Lewis, I think, has done a beautiful job. If you've ever read his presentation called "Why I'm Not a Pacifist," that he read out to the British Pacifistic Society during World War II. They invited him to come in and say, "Why aren't you a pacifist?" And he does a beautiful job, I think, of laying out why he's not a pacifist. That doesn't mean that if you say I'm not a pacifist, it means I'm a violent person who thinks we should kill people if they don't agree with our, religious views. So uh, I think my response to in most situations would be, listen, friend, brother, sister, whatever, go to the source. If you're wondering about this, what did Jesus have to say about this? Jesus did talk about being peaceful. Jesus did talk about turning the other cheek. Jesus also told the disciples to count how many swords they had, and they might be in a season, at least short term, where they might have use of a sword. We all know, we don't all know, but most Christians know that Paul justifies the civil authorities carrying a weapon with them. So I think there are times when we just have to say, sometimes it's really hard to make a determination on where do we draw the line. You've got extreme pacifists in the American West who would have said, if a Native American comes to your home and you're a Western pioneer and you've hidden your children in the cellar and they ask you where the children are, you can't lie. You have to tell them where the children are. I don't think there's anything in the scriptures that would tell us that it's wrong to essentially tell an untruth in a situation like that. There are examples of where we have to, I think, push back more than just with words. The reality is, though, that we've just had so many examples that the extremes have been taken that we really have to live with that, right? I mean, we can't justify it, nor can we correct it, but we have to understand that's the baggage that we now have. So rounding around with a really long answer, I'm sorry for that, to your
No,
original
please.
question, what would you do? How would you respond? I would encourage someone, go to the scriptures yourself and see what Christ had to say. See what the apostles of Jesus, what those men who lived with Jesus, how did they live out their life? I think you're going to find that in almost every instance, they did it peacefully. They did it by sharing, by receiving persecution and abuse rather than delivering it. I do think, however, there's a difference between individuals and corporate entities, nations. So many things that have to be plumbed before we can just come up with some broad statement of this is how Christians ought to respond to past atrocities or to current atrocities, or how do we try to convince somebody that they shouldn't give up on the Christian faith because of how Christians have, behaved.
And how would you encourage somebody to kind of begin to consider the depth of thinking like that? Because one of the things that in the introduction or the description of my podcast is, what is your worldview, and how does that worldview shape and form your understanding of meaning? And there's a book called The Universe Next Door by Sire, and he kind of, I really, really appreciate his definition of what a worldview is. I think it's really, really, really solid. And
Mhm.
so I think we live in a culture where there's a lot of sizzle, but very little steak in terms of what people And I don't say that from a perspective of that's not a demeaning thing. I just think that I've been very much guilty of that myself, and I catch myself doing it all the time. And so I don't say that demeaningly. I think that that's just a cultural tension that we have. And so, how would you encourage somebody to begin to think more deeply? And we're, again, the whole context of this conversation is, answering this from a Christian worldview. So it's like,
Yeah.
how would you encourage people when we think about, things like this? We're talking about huge historical events. It would take probably years to learn about something as significant as the Crusades. I mean, people dedicate their whole lives to these sections of history. And
Yeah.
so it's like, how do I even begin to gain context to be able to have that, what you've talked about, deeper understanding to enter into these conversations?
Yeah. I don't know that I have a definitive answer to that, John, other than to say, um, I think at least what I try to do to encourage people is to say, listen, if you're a Christ follower, um, part of being what it means to be a Christ follower is to know your faith. Um, I mean, the scriptures are just replete with calls from both Jesus and the disciples to know. And I think a lot of people want to turn to that passage there in First Corinthians that tells us, that knowledge puffs up. Yes, it can. Um, and then in context there, we want to steer clear of that kind of knowledge, a knowledge that creates a pride that puffs up, that then closes our ears to any other point of view. But knowledge is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. And we're not going to be able to speak intelligently, not just intelligently, but really in any way that makes any difference at all, unless we try to understand the subject matter. And so you're right. I mean, um, uh, any small section of the history of our world, particularly when it comes to military history, where so many of the atrocities take place, um, you can spend a lifetime just trying to, excuse me, just figure out that one period, let alone what led to it and then what the fallout from it was. So I think it's a posture of humility saying, not only do I not know everything about this, I can't know everything about this. And yet my worldview has been shaped and it is being shaped. Now, what's the best way to address a worldview that has been shaped? It is to get to the bottom of it to the best of our ability. Let's get to the facts to the best of our ability. That's usually done either through reading about it or having reasonable conversations with other people and allowing other people to speak into a scenario or to a situation or even into our worldview and give them the privilege of having the floor for a while and talk to us and to really try to consider that. It's very difficult because we all come into every situation and conversation with predispositions. That's part of what our worldview is its predispositions. Um, so I may be, I'm not being concise here because I don't know there's a definitive answer than to say a posture of humility, a posture of willingness to learn and to listen. And then when we develop, I think, our worldview or our opinion on a situation, we should hold that, um, in most instances, I think, lightly and say, or gently, softly, there's something that could still be spoken into this situation, and I need to recognize that. Um, when it comes to my own faith, I am definitive that Christ is who Christ claims to be. I want to say, I'm guarding that with the Word of God and saying nothing's going to penetrate that. That doesn't mean my understanding of it is an impenetrable fortress, and there can't be some things that I need to hear and learn that may change my worldview. My worldview has changed multiple times, as I'm sure yours has in my lifetime, probably thousands of times. That usually happens by just listening, being observant, getting at facts, and developing a posture of humility that says, I'm not right about everything.
Hmm. That was all, Pastor Jim. That was awesome. Thank you. I learned a ton from you right there. Is pretty much all
Good.
I'm saying.
Uh,
And because I think that what you talked about is like the definitiveness of, for me as a Christian, is the definitiveness of Jesus and who He is, and how you talked about how the scripture is guarding that as well as, but the worldview is also, open to hearing, reason and things like that. I think that is, I think, a really beautiful and wonderful thing for people to hear, because the idea or the term of dogmatic gets used so much in our culture. You hear it a lot in podcasts, and I think it kind of has. Does that idea kind of, the people who would label things like that in our culture today as dogmatic, do you feel like that postmodern kind of worldview that we see permeating our culture influences that at all? Does that question make any sense?
No. I think it makes sense, and I might even double down on that a little bit more and say it may be in the last 30 years, at least in Western culture, and maybe I shouldn't just make it that broad, and at least in American culture, it may be the primary obstacle, I think, to developing a healthy worldview, because it just shuts things off in the name of open-mindedness, in the name of being not developing oppressive ideas and things like that. It just shuts off avenues of communication. It also is so broad that the old statement, right? You're so open-minded that your brains are leaking out.
Interesting.
It's just too broad. There is right and wrong. I mean, there is truth and falsehood, and we all know that. I mean, there's been all kinds of books written on this, that even the people who say that we should be open-minded, they're not open-minded about certain things, and there's all kinds of quips that go back and forth on that. But it is true. We all are dogmatic in some areas of our lives, and probably rightfully so, right? I'm dogmatic in my love for my wife, my children, my grandchildren. I'm dogmatic about that. That doesn't mean I want to harm other people at their expense, but I'm dogmatic about that, and I think the scriptures call me to be dogmatic in that. I'm dogmatic about the the sanctity of marriage and the sanctity of life. But I've had people ask me before, you've been a Christian now for over 4 decades. If I could convince you that Jesus wasn't who Jesus was, would you change your mind? And my answer is, well, of course I would. You've convinced me. If you've convinced me, you've convinced me. I would change my mind. I want to go where the truth is. I believe the truth is with Christ. I believe the truth is with a biblical worldview. That doesn't mean I think I've got it all figured out, but I think that's the truth. I'm dogmatic about that. But even in my dogmatism, I don't want to be cruel, unjust, close-minded, nor do I want to say you could never convince me otherwise. Listen, if Jesus isn't the answer, I want to know what the answer is. I'm just convinced that he is. And I recognize I was born in the West. I was raised by Catholic parents. And for those things, I don't apologize to simply say, thank you, Lord, for that. That's a good thing. I think God's sovereignty plays into many of those things. And this isn't a podcast about sovereignty, but some of those things I think we just have to say, I'm thankful for that. It is true. If I were raised in some parts of the Middle East, I probably would have been raised by Muslim parents. That is absolutely true. Doesn't mean I would have never had an opportunity to know Christ, but it certainly would have been more difficult. And so I'm thankful that I was raised in a Western society with Catholic parents. That's a blessing from God that I can't take credit for. I can only say thank you for that.
Yeah. And I think that gets, that's a question that I had to wrestle with too. I was in Afghanistan and I saw this young man, and we were walking around, and I'll never forget, as long as I live, I saw this young man, and I thought to myself, I was like, what in the world are the chances that this young man's going to ever hear the gospel? And the reason I say that story is I wrestled with that idea that you talked about justness. I just wrestled in my soul for years about it. And to kind of tie this to the point, to enter into those historical responsibility conversations in a way that's meaningful, that's matterful, that isn't easily offended. Because I often learned that when you don't know, or oftentimes people who don't know, who haven't done that work to learn and to know, their response is often very hostile, because it's almost like a fallback defensive response.
Yeah.
Do you think the things that you talked about learning a worldview, it seems to be something that takes a lot of hard work? It's just, it takes time, it takes effort, it takes mental gymnastics to work through these difficult things. Do you think that there's just an apathy culturally for us where people don't want to dig into those things because it's just hard? Or do you think it's more of to dig into those things oftentimes can begin to lead to the questions that lead to the things that matter, like you talked about, going to the source, which then in turn, maybe somebody could begin to read the words of Jesus in the Bible. And then all of a sudden you're talking about the eternal struggle between what actually is going place, which is people's eternal destiny and souls.
Yes. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so do you feel like it's more of a spiritual battle that's taking place there to keep people from wanting to know what is right or pursue things? Or just, do you think it's just a general laziness and apathy that's cultural?
I think it's all of the above. I certainly think there's a spiritual aspect to this. Paul tells the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians 4, the God of this age has blinded the minds of unbelievers so they cannot see the light of the gospel, the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. There are spiritual forces at work. And again, that takes us in another direction as well. I don't want to make it sound like there's a devil behind every rock and he's whispering in our ear all the time. But it is first and foremost, I think, a spiritual battle. And again, I'm a Christian, and so I think the scriptures teach us that, right? Paul tells us we're not fighting against flesh and blood. We're fighting against principalities and forces and who are aligned against us. So I think it is first and foremost a spiritual battle. I think that apathy a lot of times comes from just a spiritual apathy. That doesn't take the onus away from all human beings. Many human beings have all the abilities to know more about these things, and yet they just don't care because they're more interested in, in our culture, sports and video games and none of those in and of themselves are sinful, but they are used in many instances to just kind of get us into a malaise where we're just not interested about the most important questions of life. And sadly, I just see this as a pastor in so many people's lives, and I have to fight it in my own life at times. We are at times, I think, inherently lazy. We want things just given to us, and so developing a worldview. Look, having a worldview is the easiest thing in the world. We just all have it. It just happens to us. Developing a worldview takes time. It takes effort. And I think it's incumbent upon the vast majority of people to put that effort in. I think God would call us to put that effort in. Obviously, you have people with profound special needs, young children who die before reaching an age of being able to have that kind of concrete understanding. That responsibility is not theirs to own. But for the vast majority of people who reach, a state of mental maturity, particularly again in Western cultures, there's just really very few excuses for not trying to plumb the depths of the most important questions in the world. And just, I think a lot of people, John, they don't care. Now, with one quick caveat to that, I think there are some people who have just a gift of faith. And they don't have to go through all the mental gymnastics that I have to. I want to know if there's a question, I want to know the answer to it. And I'm not saying that makes me like, wow, I'm this profound thinker. That's not it. I've got a normal IQ. I'm not a genius level thinker. I have to work hard to get at this stuff. But, there are some people who I've just found they just have a very peaceful way of existing, and they believe the gospel, they trust in Christ, and they don't have to have the answers to every single question. And I think that can be a beautiful thing as well, that we shouldn't constantly be harassing them. Well, why don't you think about that? Why haven't you questioned? Why don't you think about Calvinism and Arminianism and Pelagianism and why aren't you thinking about just war theory and all these kind of things? Some people, they're just like, because I don't care. I have other things that I'm doing in life, and I trust God. And I think that can be a really beautiful thing as well. Not everybody's called to be an apologist. Not everybody's called to do a podcast. Not everybody's called to do these things. Some people, they just believe, and it's a beautiful thing. And I think we should honor that, as well.
I'm genuinely grateful that you said that, because I think, I don't know if it's just shining light on my own pride, because it potentially could be, but I think to myself that anybody who's not digging into these things is wrong. And so for you to challenge me, or you didn't do it directly, you just did it because you answered the question and I was like, oh, wow, I'm wrong. So the point is that I'm very thankful you shared that because that challenges my perspective and stand. And
Yeah.
so I just want to say thank you for sharing that because that's something that I hadn't thought about. So, um, to ask you this next question, and this kind of goes through everything we've talked about up to this point, the historical realities and the challenges, the worldview development to help navigate those issues. One of the things that I listened to and heard the other day from a friend of mine at work who's an atheist, and what this individual talked about was if we just didn't have any of these religious issues, if you think historically about all the things that have happened that are awful because of religion, I mean, it's a very long and awful list. And he just said, if we just didn't have all of this, he said people would just stop being worried about what's going to happen after we die. Kind of goes back and harkens back to maybe Stephen Hawking, right? Like religion's just
Yeah.
made up by people who are afraid of the dark, right? Like,
Yes.
this idea that, if we just got rid of all that, people would just focus on making their lives better, people's lives better on this earth, and people wouldn't get lost in the sauce and we'd be able just to do, helpful, normal things. Now, I know kind of in essence how I would have responded to that, but I think that that's a great kind of synopsis of when you think about historical responsibility, it's such a mess. There's
Hmm.
just so much for everything or for every point that I make, there's an easy counterpoint to it. So it's like, it's so hard to get anywhere. And then you have kind of this inroad where this individual that I talked about, this friend of mine, he's just like, why don't we just get rid of all of it? Because if we did, everybody would just do better and be better. I obviously don't agree with that.
Yeah.
But the point is like, how would you kind of looking at that in light of what we're talking about, how would you approach responding to that kind of statement that guy made at work?
Yeah. Well, I would just say it's historically inaccurate, and human nature tells us that's just not true. The reality is, and we I guess we could flesh this out some more, but Christianity has brought far more benefit and peace to our world than it has violence and pogroms and other things like that. And the reality is that pagan cultures have created incredibly violent societies. The Roman Empire was here for the better part of 600 to 800 years, incredibly violent. It was a pagan culture. Now, obviously, after the 4th century, it was at least tacitly Christian, but um, um, atheists go to war. Um, the Soviet Union and the current Russian republic, they are based on a secular slash atheistic worldview, and they go to war. They kill people. Everybody kills people. This is just the history of humankind. This is the fall. This is Genesis 3. This is things getting bent. And this is why Christ came, and this is one of the great hopes of the consummation, and that is wrong things will be made right, and they won't be done again. But we're all fighting against a sin nature, atheists and Christians alike, and every other person who adheres to any other world religion. We're all fighting against a sin nature, if the scriptures are true. If they're not, I don't know um, what describes or what explains the amount of violence across the board in human history. Obviously, Darwinian evolutionists would say it's all about the fight for survival, but that doesn't make it right any more right than saying I'm doing it in the name of Christ. You're still killing people. You're still wiping out entire populations. All the things that have been done. That is not. That is not inherently just a religious thing. That's a human condition. And, I love John Lennon and I love the Beatles, but Lennon was just wrong in his song Imagine. Imagine, there's no religion, everyone living in peace. He's absolutely wrong. We'd be killing each other just like we are now. Uh, the lack of religion would not create peace in culture. It just wouldn't. Historically, we know that. And I think just knowing human nature, we just know that would not make us all get along with each other.
Yeah. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about now is kind of this idea of it kind of takes the step from the past to the present of the current actions and the reality of specifically our culture in America, um, of this kind of this, what I see is an infusion of conservative politics and evangelicalism. and
Hmm.
how I feel like there might be some muddying there because there is a lot of principles and ethics that do align with each other.
Yeah.
However, I think that there can be a tendency for people to consider themselves to be quote unquote Christians because they have politically conservative leanings
Right.
who would not acknowledge the person of Jesus Christ as who he is. And I
Right.
think that what I'm observing, at least from the outside looking in, and I'm very open to being challenged, told I'm wrong, told I'm an idiot, whatever helps me learn, is to I see people acting now on behalf of what they would consider to be the Christian or evangelical people in the United States who clearly are not believers in and of themselves.
Sure. Yeah.
Um, and I see the potential for historical responsibility and people who will inherit those actions in the years to come, because we're doing massive political shifting in America to the point it's in my opinion it's unsustainable. But the next election cycle could shift us so dramatically in a direction that is so counter to the Christian worldview to the point to potentially even hostility.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
so, how would you how do you assess kind of that general idea culturally in America for people who would quote unquote call themselves a Christian because they're conservative in their leaning, but they're not actually a believer, but the things that they're saying in media and in other things, especially in the new media spaces where I see it a lot, who, because they're acting and speaking and doing the things that they're saying, acting and doing, it's going to probably breed potential consequences because the world doesn't look at that and delineate between, oh, they're not actually Christians.
Yes.
Um, and so have you given that any thought? Do you think that that idea has merit?
Yeah. I mean, that concerns me as well. I think a lot of times, in casual conversations amongst what we would call evangelical Christians, or people who would call themselves Christian. Maybe they don't know the moniker evangelical, but um, and it's kind of like, well, I'm a Christian, and I know it's usually not this cut and dry, but then it just basically boils down to who'd you vote for in the last election. Um, the reality is that the Republicans are not going to save America. The Democrats aren't either, and neither are the Libertarians or any other political party that may arise. Even with the rise of Christian nationalism and this idea of if we could just get a Christian prince and get back to the Decalogue and again, some of those things, they resonate with me. Would I like to have a president who's a really solid Christian who he or she is living according to the biblical understanding of what it really means to be a Christ follower? Absolutely, I would take that any day of the year. But to say that in and of itself would save America or would be a clear indicator that somebody's a Christian, it just isn't. We determine whether we're a Christ follower based on our commitment to Christ, our faith in Christ. Paul says in Romans 8, right? The Spirit in us, testifies with Christ's Spirit that we are God's children. That's more of an internal thing that's taking place there. Anybody can say anything, right? I've said this even from the pulpit. I could tell people I'm a Muslim, right? And say, I'm a good Muslim. Don't you dare say I'm not a Muslim. And they say, well, do you read the Quran? No, I don't do that. Do you pray 5 times a day? No. Do you follow the pillars of Islam? No, not really. Have you ever made a pilgrimage to Mecca? No, and I never intend to do that. Well, then you're not a Muslim. Well, actually, I am a Muslim, and how dare you say I'm not? Anybody can say anything. I'm clearly not a Muslim. I don't act like a Muslim. I don't believe what Muslims believe. I'm a Christ follower. What does the scripture say, right? Jesus says, if you believe me, you obey my commandments. There's just so many different, again, getting to the source that tells us this is what a Christ follower is. Now, can we all flesh that out perfectly and say, well, this Christian's a pacifist, but this Christian is in the military? No, we have to have some discussions about that. But this whole idea that has just permeated our culture that if they say they're a Christian, then they're a Christian, or if they say they're this, you can't question that. I just think we're in big trouble when we do that. And when we allow, again, in the political realm, someone to say, I'm a Christian, and yet to demonstrate time and time and time again that they do not follow biblical principles or follow that Christ is not their exemplar, then I think we're just silly to say, well, they must be a Christian because they say they are. That's not even in the political world. That's in everywhere. we're known by our fruit. And to pretend like we're not, I think, is just not only unbiblical, but it's not wise.
Hmm. Yeah. And one of the things that I try to do in every podcast with every guest is at the end, the goal is to assign meaning to whatever the matter or the topic is that we're talking about. And so what we're talking about is obviously a huge topic that ranges literally thousands of years. I mean, you could trace it back to the beginning of humanity. So I know that I've asked a lot of you to answer questions that are so broad, and I really appreciate your willingness to be patient in light of those questions. But um, how do you kind of assign the idea of meaning when you consider this topic that we're talking about? Is that a fair question to ask regarding something like this, or does that like meaning about talking about a topic, or does that question just make no sense?
I think it could make sense. I think I would need you to define that a little bit more clearly for me, to at least to answer that question, or give my best shot at the answer to that question. How do we define meaning in terms of historical responsibility? Um, in what way do you mean, John? I mean, would you say to me personally, Jim, do you feel responsible for the Crusades? Do you feel responsible for the conquest of Latin and South America? Do you feel responsible for Western expansion and things from Manifest Destiny and the Monroe Doctrine and all the other things they all go on both sides of that spectrum? I don't feel responsible for those. Um, does that give meaning, at least to some extent, to how I think about who I am in this world and as a Christ follower? Again, in the only way that I can know that, and that is as Jym Gregory, who grew up in this setting with these parents and were giving these opportunities and followed up on these opportunities and didn't follow up on these opportunities. Yes, it helps me to understand meaning for me. Can I then expand that out to say it gives meaning to the whole Christian experience? I'm not sure I can do that, nor am I sure I've even pegged your question there. So
No, I think what you've done is you've taken a terrible question and you've made sense of it. So, good for you. No, that's exactly that was a terrible question, but you, I think, um, turned it into something that would be meaningful to any listeners. So, I just get to say thank you for throwing me what are those circular, just a floaty. Have you ever seen that at Saturday Night Live video skit with Jim Carrey when he's the lifeguard for the hot tub?
yes, I have. Yes.
That's
Yeah.
I was drowning in the hot tub there with that horrible question, but you were right there to help me out. No, I really appreciate that.
Mm.
So the last question I have for you, Jim, and again, thank you for giving of your time today, is do you think that this topic that I brought up, and I hinted at this at the very beginning, right? I've thought a ton about this since I read that book and that passage of that book. And I've thought that it's really, really important and matterful and meaningful. Do you think that this topic of considering the idea of historical responsibility and how to respond to it, do you think it's something do you think it even matters? Do you think it warrants that type of time? Or would you encourage people to maybe, if you're going to give time, maybe give it somewhere else?
No, I think it absolutely warrants it. I mean, I think that quote from Gonzalez, and incidentally, I love his volume 1 and 2 of Christian history. He's a wonderful historian. Um, I think we should ponder these things. I think, again, for those who want to know, right? My doctoral work is in Christian apologetics. To ignore this as an apologist would be, I think, almost fatal to my ability to work as a Christian apologist, and take even Christian apologetics outside of it. My work as a pastor, I think it's incumbent upon me to address these kind of issues, because these are the questions that are on the minds of a lot of people. Now, in fairness, I think not so much on the minds of evangelical Christians, but it is on the minds of those people that, using a term that can be pejorative, but I don't mean it in that sense, a seeker, someone who wants to know, listen, I'm interested in Christianity, but I got some serious questions about the history of the church and of Christianity in general. And do I want to align myself with that? Or what I hear often is, I love Jesus, I don't like Christians, which again, that I understand how it makes sense from a non-believer's viewpoint, but it can't make sense for a Christian. We have to say, you cannot separate those, right? To say I love Jesus, but I don't love Jesus's church. Jesus came not exclusively, but certainly at least part of the incarnation and the work of Christ was to build a church. It is the pillar and truth, the pillar and what is it? How does Paul say that to Timothy? It is the pillar of Christianity. Truth is the world knows truth because of the Church of Jesus Christ. So we have to, I think, if we're going to engage in these kind of conversations with people who are interested, and even, with atheists who just want to argue about it, I think we should at least be able to say, hey, I understand your argument. Here's how I might push back on that, and to do that gently. I mean, how does an atheist eventually come to know Christ unless somebody is actually speaking into their lives? Outside of the few instances, I think, where God just works supernaturally to bring about an understanding. I love to see and hear stories about that in the Muslim world. I rejoice in that, but I think that's the exception and not the rule. We've got to be able to engage with people. If not, we're not going to be able to do the work of apologetics. There's no way I could shepherd people in the church and just ignore these massive worldview questions. So that's a long answer to a short question, but I absolutely think we need to discuss these things, talk about these things. That's why I was excited to say yes to come on board with this podcast, today. These are conversations we need to have. And obviously you and I, we have barely scratched the surface of what all could be talked about, here. We could spend this much time and more just talking about, again, what I mentioned earlier, Western expansion. What was that all about? Why did so many Christians and so many politicians who claim to know Christ, why did they do it the way they did it? Again, getting back to, do I feel responsible for that? No, I don't feel a personal responsibility for that. Am I sorry for how that happened in many instances? My answer is yes. I'm sorry. I don't know what that counts for. It probably doesn't count for anything. But personally, I wish some of those things didn't happen, for sure.
Well, this has been something that, as I've thought about it and as I've kind of seen responses from various people to this, sensationalism sells. I've said that in a lot of episodes that I've done, and especially when you get into certain spaces and whether that's podcasting or otherwise, I see a lot of responses that are very sensational to this. And I think that my hope and my goal was to, number one, talk to somebody who I know would tie it back to the gospel, which you've done so wonderfully. So thank you for that. But also to present a balanced perspective to this. And Pastor Jym, I really think that you've done that in a really, really, really good way. And I think that it potentially could be very beneficial to some people to hear. So I just wanted to say that simply just to say thank you. Thank you for giving of your intellectual prowess, and also to just genuinely giving of your time. I know that your time very much is precious. So thank you.
Yeah, you bet, John. I've enjoyed it. I hope it's been helpful for your listeners, for sure. And by the way, I'm one of your listeners now. I've really enjoyed listening to the podcast. So
that's super kind of you, Jym. Thank you.
Yep, you bet. Thanks, brother.